guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. Some stories begin with a single stitch pulled taut against the fabric of a small life. Others begin with the scent of lavender that will not leave a seamstress's hands even after she has washed and washed until her fingers are raw. This is one of those stories, of a woman whose needle and thrift, shame and judgment, steadiness and stubbornness were the very threads by which a farm and a family were mended. Before I begin the tale itself, if you are listening and will walk with Clara through the years, stay until the end, and if the story moves you, please subscribe and leave a like. Tell me where you are listening from in the comments. There is a quiet map of small towns and distant valleys threaded through these lives, and I would be glad to know which of you hears the rustle of Clara's skirts as clearly as I do. The valley lay like a pocket cut from the world. Low hills softened by lavender and rye, a ribbon of river that kept time with the seasons, and the Casa Grande de Fazenda Valente sitting on its rise as if it had always watched the weather. In the winter of 1878, a thin snow came down one night, an unusual hush that silvered the stone and left a white bruise in the hollows of the fields. The snow made the chapel bell sound farther than it ought. It pulled the breath of the workers into small lamps inside their mouths. It made Clara hold the needle tighter. At 20, Clara's hands were small and sure. She wore the calluses of a life spent in sewing circles and in the cramped light of kitchen lamps, fingers that could stitch an heirloom and mend a widow's gown with the same patience. The cottage where she lived leaned into the slope below the road, leaning against the scent of the lavender patch she kept. Mercedes, who had once been housekeeper and mistress of all gentle wisdom there, lay in the back room with fever and cough that rattled like loose beads. Clara sat by her bedside as if the act of sitting could hold the illness away. She boiled water for compresses, warmed laudanum in a thimble to ease Mercedes' cough, and read the lines of a Bible that had seen 3 generations of hands. Work had been a circle of quiet tasks, mending the farm workers' shirts, embroidery for the parish women, occasional tailoring that brought coin enough for flour and a small lamp oil. There was no suitor, no family pressing for a match. Clara's father had gone to the city years before and did not return. The world she occupied was measured by the distance between the cottage and the Casa Grande, by the bend in the road where the capataz's carroza turned, and by the sound of the church bell. It was small, and it was all she had. It was also, very possibly, unsustainable. Dom Augusto Valente came to the cottage on a gray morning that smelled of wet earth and old books. She thought of Mercedes, the woman who had taught her to count stitches as prayers, and had given her a place by the hearth when the world could have left her to the road. And she thought of the children who worked the fields, of the thin school that closed after a harvest. The decision did not belong to a single person. It belonged to all of them. "I will marry you," Clara said. There was a silence so quick it was like the snap of a thread. Mercedes' breath came sharp and then softer. Dr. Tavares' face, gray and creased, was unreadable. "But only if certain things are made clear," Clara continued. "Not for pride, nor for vanity, for the sake of those I love and for mine own dignity." Dom Augusto's brows drew together. He had expected a refusal or hesitance accompanied by bribery. He had not expected terms. "You name them," he said gently. Clara's voice did not shake. "First, Mercedes shall have a home, her own room in the Casa Grande, with a window that faces the lavender, and the first care of a physician paid by your house as long as she needs it. Second, the child that I bear shall be named as your heir immediately in your testament. If you die within a year, a guardian shall be appointed who is not your cousin Rodolfo. Third, I will not be hidden. I will have access to the library and to your council on stewardship. I will learn, for the work of a farm is not merely stones and seeds, but books and rules, and I would not be a silent mistress. Fourth, I will be given funds to ensure the gentle workers can have a school and a small dispensary for common ailments." Dom Augusto's fingers moved, the skin of his knuckles faintly blue where age had thinned it. He had not expected the lists and conditions to come so calmly. He had imagined a woman who would be grateful or frightened into silence. Clara's terms were not pleas. They were the measures of a person who had thought long at night with a lamp and a thimble. "You ask much," he said. "I ask for dignity," she replied. "I ask you keep your word." He looked at Mercedes, who closed her eyes as if the room were suddenly too bright. Mercedes' hand found Clara's under the quilt. Warmth moved through Clara's palm as through a prayer. "So be it," Dom Augusto said. "I have a hand as much for making agreements as for writing them. We shall have the attorney draw the testament, and I shall—" He hesitated. "I shall have the chapel meet us to witness. There is little time." They were married in the chapel beneath a low ceiling of dark wood, with the padre reading slowly as if the words might lengthen the days. The ceremony was small. Mercedes in a chair near the foot of the altar, Dona Eulalia, governess of the Casa Grande, arranging the hems of Clara's simple dress, and a small contingent of workers whose eyes were wet but proud. The snow had melted to a silver drizzle that morning. Dom Augusto's hand in Clara's was neither warm nor remote. It was steady. In the first days that followed, the house felt like a ship newly trimmed. Clara's belongings were moved into a modest room with a view of the lavender, and Mercedes took to the room prepared for her. The workers came with baskets of onions and a sack of flour. They spoke to Clara as if she were newly entitled, but also as a woman they already trusted. Rodolfo watched from the edges. The cousin's posture was the only thing that did not soften. He appeared at the edges of gatherings with inquiries and with glances that sought to measure the estate for his appetite. Don Augusto kept his promise about the library. For all his pragmatic mind, he loved books like other men loved good wine. He led Clara between shelves, tracing the spines with the same gentleness she used on a needle. "Knowledge is a way of keeping the land honest," he told her. "You can learn the accounts, the ledgers, the names of seeds, and the years best for sowing. You will not be a woman who sits on a dais plucking at a handkerchief. You will be a worker at my side." At nights, after the lamps had been put to low, he sat with Clara and taught her to read ledger columns and to tell the difference between a good soil and a poor one by sight. He taught in terms she could wear, the turn of a page, like the turn of a plow, the way a paragraph could hold a season. There were moments of holiness in those lessons, an old man with only a year to pass on what he loved, and a young woman with calloused fingers learning the language of stewardship. Clara read with the greedy patience of one who knows words are scarce as coins. She read treatises on crop rotation, letters on the management of serfs and hired hands. Their vocabulary was sober and sometimes brutal, but she learned to translate it into compassion. She learned how to count and to keep the names of those who owed small debts, so that the capataz, Sebastian, would not cheat them. She found in the margins of a forgotten volume scribbles in Dom Augusto's hand, notes about building a small school, about setting aside a corner of land for common use during hard seasons. He had thought of these things before. He had simply lacked stamina to act. Clara's presence made will into action. There was, in time, a softness between them two, a respect that bent toward affection. It was not a love as youth imagines, all fever and unlocking. It was the kind that grows like moss on stone, patient and steady, finding the sheltered places. Clara came to learn the small demands of his days, the way he liked his tea with a slice of lemon, the way he woke at dawn to write a letter and paused to look at the river, the way his hands trembled when he asked questions about his accounts. He, in turn, learned the exact angle at which she set pins, the little exhalation he made when a thread refused to obey his will. Rumor did not stay silent in a valley such as theirs. Some called the marriage an arrangement. Some pitied the old man. Some admired the courage of the seamstress. Rodolfo's visits grew sharper. It was jealousy, more than greed, that made him clumsy. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet and did not like it. Weeks became months. Mercedes's fever receded, and she grew thinner but sharper in mind. She taught children in a spare room how to read. The school Clara had asked for during her bargain took shape out of a small storeroom. The workers' children began to attend on certain mornings, and a woman from the village, once a teacher, was given a small stipend to instruct them in letters and numbers. The dispensary was tiny, a cabinet in the back of the apothecary room where Dr. Tavares stored bandages and bottles of laudanum and tinctures. It was nothing luxurious, but it was a beginning. When news came that Clara was with child, the Casa Grande seemed to wait. The midwife had come from a neighboring town, an old woman with hands like folded maps. Mercedes cried silently behind her palms. Dom Augusto's hand found Clara's. There was a small, peculiar joy in the house that felt almost indecent given the pale shape of the present. But joy had always been defiant in that house. It pressed up against sorrow like sun on a frost. Pregnancy was a season of quiet intimacy and of practical reordering. Clara ate bread dosed with milk and the sweet of oranges. She mended the mittens of the men who worked the fields and studied the ledgers, her fingers learning to hold both needle and ink. Dom Augusto would walk with her by the lavender at dusk, and they would talk of the child in a language cautious of boasting. He made plans with the careful expectancy of a man making a small city out of hope. A nurse at hand, a lawyer to confirm the testament's clauses, a small chest of linens to be embroidered by Mercedes. But the world does not slow because of hopes. There were rains that drowned late plantings, a fever among the herd that forced the capataz to spend nights on the farm, and letters from Rodolfo that threatened litigation as if law were a weapon instead of a shield. The cousin had retained a notary from the town, printed letters with seals and a tone of ownership. He accused Dom Augusto of unsoundness in the making of his testament, hinted that a woman of humble birth could not be a steward. He called the match a scandal. Dom Augusto read the letters with a face like a closed book. "He will do his worst," he said to Clara one night by the library lamp. "He will question contracts, call for counsel. But law can be a long road traveled by those who can afford the steps. I will not allow the workers to be thrown to the road for his vindictiveness." "You cannot carry the estate alone," Clara said, and felt the oddness of saying such things aloud. That a woman once paid by the hour would be arguing accounts against a cousin who wore brocade in his pockets. She had not married for love alone. She had married to save a place that held the faces of people who had no voice. "But we can make the steps a little easier to bear." He smiled, a small thing. "If I had sufficient money for coffers and for counsel, I would see the end of this without cost. But these things are as they are. You have given me more than the law can buy." As the weather warmed toward the later months, the house filled with preparation. Linens, a small cradle brought in from the storeroom, a shawl Mercedes had kept for the first child of her mistress when she had been young. There were frequent visits from Dr. Tavares, who was a man of pragmatic words and soft hands. He measured pulses and prepared a small chest of medicines that he said might be needed should labor come hard. People spoke in hushed tones of winter snow again, of winter as a symbol and a trial. Then, on a night the river murmured like a tired thing, Clara felt the first true pain. It was a tightening that carried her breath away for a moment, and left her with a long remembering of herself as small and human. She rose from bed, hands finding her dress, and went to Mercedes' room. The old woman sat in her chair with the lamp low, the wick guttering. "They come," Clara whispered. Mercedes' eyes were a weathered map of a woman who had seen births and deaths both. She reached and took Clara's fingers, squeezing them as if the pressure could pass knowledge. "You have taught me to count," Mercedes said. "Count the breaths, child. Count when the heart leans and when it rests." Outside, the wind moved through the lavender. Don Augusto had insisted all day on maintaining a calm that sometimes was like a pretense and other times was a practice of the heart. He moved through the house giving small orders, the midwife, the nurse, a message to the capataz to bring extra blankets. There was a discipline in his motions. Years of running an estate teach a man to plan for contingencies. Yet, when Clara felt pain, he held her hand as if he were the one learning to endure. The midwife, an old woman called Anna, arrived at midnight. She smelled of herbs and vinegar, and she had a voice like a small bell. She took Clara's hand in her own and spoke of breathing and of making room. Mercedes sat by, eyes closed, murmuring a blessing. Dona Eulalia paced occasionally, and did small tasks that steadied the room, placing a cool cloth here, collecting the laudanum there. The labor was long and was not kind. There were hours when Clara measured pain like a kind of work, counting the breaths and listening to the cries of the house outside. Dom Augusto slept in a chair, with his cane across his knees and a book that lay open and unread. He had given himself wholly to the tasks, arranging for the testament's safekeeping, for the attorney to be present should any mischief be afoot. Yet, in the pauses, he looked at Clara with a tenderness that was no longer merely filial or respectful. It had become a love of a practical man who had been taught by a woman. When the child came, it was with a sound like an unwilling trumpet and a small, fierce life that filled the room. The midwife said a word of relief and a small blessing. Mercedes wept openly. Dona Eulalia made gestures like a woman who had made many beds but had not seen this very thing before. The infant was wet and red and screeched as if in surprise at the world. Dom Augusto took the child with myrrh of awe on his face and held the small body like a fragile ledger. They named him Gabriel at once, or rather Dom Augusto did, and Clara added to it with careful thought. It was a name both of testaments and of gentle hope. There was joy and an unbearable kind of sorrow braided together. The house was filled with the smell of linens and of laudanum and of the fatness of warm milk. Clara lay exhausted, fingers raw, and she heard the conversation of adults as if through water. People spoke of the child, of the testament, of Rodolfo and what he might do. Dom Augusto kissed her forehead with a tenderness that had become almost confessional. That night, Clara slept with the child beside her. Mercedes dozed in her chair by the hearth, her hand resting on the future. The Casa Grande hummed like a thing held together by careful hands. A week later, disease, cruel and sudden, took its toll. Dom Augusto, who had been fragile from the first, whose breath had been a measure of sand slipping through a chamber, grew paler. The cough he had long held as a secret flame deepened. Dr. Tavares came every hour and watched the color of his lips. The house waited, again, with the curiosity and dread of a clock that might stop. Dom Augusto's death was quick and quiet by the standards of tragedy. He called Clara to his bedside in the early morning and took her hand with the same gentleness with which he had once handled the spines of books. "You have kept your terms," he said, voice thin as a thread. "You have turned my intention into work. You have warmed the soil I meant to leave to the valley. For that I am grateful." Clara felt the pull of grief like a rope. She had loved him in the way one loves a teacher who becomes a companion, grateful, complex, full of tenderness. It was not the roving fever of youth, it was a deep, abiding sorrow that asked for management and for the fixing of affairs. "Keep the library," she said. "Teach the children. Keep Mercedes' room." Her voice was small but decisive. She had been through the bargain and had kept to it. In the end, it had been both a contract and an offering. Dom Augusto's eyes closed. There was no great fanfare, no melodrama. The chapel had a solemn service, while snow, soft and late, settled again on the hill. The parish priest read the rites and spoke of stewardship and of the fleeting nature of life. He spoke of heaven as of a distant field. The workers from the valley wore their best shirts, and many pressed forward to touch the coffin, as if to make certain this man had been real. Rodolfo watched from the fringes with a mixture of envy and calculation. In the days that followed came the legal tempests. Rodolfo went to the town and found a notary who was less concerned with justice than with coin. He declared the testament unsound, said that a woman of Clara's standing could not be given the authority to administer an estate, and demanded that an inquiry be made. The papers were heavy with language that belonged to large rooms and stiff collars. The valley felt the thunder of it as if rain were on the way. Clara, who had learned to read the lines of a ledger in the lamplight, sat with the attorney Dom Augusto had trusted. She read the testament aloud, slowly, so that the lawyer could mark each clause that had been carefully set. The immediate designation of Gabriel as heir, the appointment of a guardian who was not Rodolfo, the provision that Mercedes be cared for always, the funds set aside for a school and a dispensary. Each clause was a stitch in a fabric Dom Augusto had planned to leave intact. Rodolfo's argument turned on custom and on the notion of capacity. He called witnesses who spoke of the seamstress's humble birth and her supposed lack of standing. But Clara had prepared for such arguments. Dom Augusto had, in his last clear hours, moved his accounts into the hands of a lawyer who was honest, and had left letters that showed his intent. The law of the land was not indifferent to clear signatures and to the weight of evidence. Witnesses from the workers and from the notary's clerk testified to the clarity of Dom Augusto's mind when he signed. The small school teacher spoke of Dom Augusto's promises to the children. The capataz, Sebastian, spoke of the careful way the master had tended to every account, and how he had requested Clara be taught. In the end, the law, slow and cumbersome though it was, ruled in favor of the testament. Rodolfo's challenge failed, not because he was stupid, but because Dom Augusto had been meticulous. There was a small celebration among the workers, a relief that was almost like a prayer. The farm would not be parceled and sold. The valley would not lose its heart. Clara took up the administration of the estate with a heavy heart and a clear mind. The mourning period was observed with ritual, the chapel, the prayers, the slow turning of pages in the ledgers as if each line were a bead on a rosary. Yet the work of the farm remained. The seasons did not pause for grief. There were accounts to be paid, harvests to collect, workers to be fed and housed. Clara took to the library as to a well and drank. She made decisions with care. Improvements to the drainage of the fields, the hiring of a master to teach the children reading and arithmetic, the setting up of a small dispensary with a matron who could stitch and clean and apply poultices. Hare's reforms were small in the beginning. Bookcases moved into rooms for the workers, a cart for the infirm to be moved to the town for supplies, but they multiplied as trust grew. The capataz, Sebastian, proved himself loyal in ways that money could not buy. Dona Eulalia ran the household with an authority softened now by a respect for Clara's decisions. Mercedes died several years later, wrapped in the lavender she had loved, her hands folded in emotion that had been habit for long decades. She left Clara with a smile and with the blessing of a life that had been mended and made full. Gabriel grew with the patience of the valley, steady, curious, given to long afternoons with a book in his lap. Clara kept the promise of education. He read law because it seemed to him the metalwork of justice, a craft by which fences could be mended and wrongs assessed. He saw, in the accounts his mother kept, and in the tales of injustice from the fields, a reason to study. The boy who had come to the world in a night of snow and lamp oil would one day argue in courts and speak for the poor who had no one to speak for them. Years would pass, and Clara would be older by the soft measures of time, lines at her eyes, strength in her hands. She would walk the fields and see improvements that were hers in essence and in practice. A small school with a proper roof, a dispensary with clean bandages, cottages mended with care. The workers would have pensions of sorts. Those who had labored their whole lives were granted small stipends and a plot of land at the end of their years. The library, that had once been the private pleasure of a dying man, became a place of learning for many. By request, Dom Augusto's notes sat in the margins like a map. Rodolfo lived in the town, and grumbled when the harvests returned more abundant than ever. He never quite recovered the taste of the estate. The valley, by contrast, prospered. Gabriel returned from his studies as a young man with a posture at once of law and of mercy. He would later stand in courtrooms to defend the rights of workers, drawing on memories of his mother's hands and on ledgers kept by a woman who had learned to read the world in book spines and sewing lines. Yet all of this, marriage, birth, death, court, had begun with a bargain shaped by a man whose time was short and a woman whose dignity was firm. There were nights Clara sat in the library, the newborn small chest rising in sleep beside her, and thought of the bargain as a cloth that had been turned inside out and washed until it was whole. She had felt humiliation in the beginning, the knowledge that she had stepped into a household by necessity rather than by elegance. But she had never let that humiliation govern her life. She had sewn dignity into each day. Later, when spring came and the lavender returned to its riot of color, Clara climbed the little hill where the family cemetery crouched like a small island of memory. She walked alone between stones that bore names and dates, feeling the tenacity of the valley beneath her boots. She knelt by the stone that marked a man whose measures had been good, and whose heart, in the end, had been generous. She set a sprig of lavender by the base and whispered a blessing. There was a continuity that pleased her more than triumph did. The farm kept on, its threshing and sowing and the small rituals of a community whose fortunes had been nearly broken but were not. Gabriel, as he grew and learned law, did not forget the dispensary or the school. He brought men who were poor into rooms where judges sat and made arguments that would be remembered not for grandeur, but for mercy. Clara's life had been altered by a proposal, a proposition offered in the face of mortality and accepted for reasons that had more to do with survival than with romance. Yet that proposal had opened a passage through which things better than comfort could come. Stewardship that honored workers, education for children who might have been left to the fields, a model of leadership that grew from care rather than from anchorage in class. In the end, when she stood in the doorway of the Casa Grande and watched the valley stretch under a late autumn sun, Clara felt a kind of peace. She held the needle in her hand as always, threading the same thin line that had been no less prayer than work. She knew that the years had been hard, and that the bargain had cost her more than pride. But she also knew that the cost had been turned into benefit, and that the lives of many had been steadied by the same steady hand that mended shirts and ledgers alike. The lavender bent in the wind like a congregation bowed in a chapel. In a small study at the back of the Casa Grande, a library lamp burned over accounts that had been straightened and over a name, Gabriel Valente, written once by a young mother who had stitched hope into cloth and law into paper. The valley kept its rhythm. The graves on the hill were tended. The school bell rang each morning, and the dispensary door opened on set days. There were still problems and quarrels. There were men who would press wrongs, and those who would keep faith. But there was a continuity that had not existed before, the kind that grows from the hardy work of people who set small things right. And Clara, who had once been a seamstress in a cottage smelling of lavender, had become steward of a place where many learned to keep their children safe and to read the letters on a ledger. She had taken a bargain made in the shadow of death and made it into a life that stood quietly for justice and for care. Outside the Casa Grande, the snow that had once made the hill so silent returned and melted again, like a promise kept. Clara placed a small sprig of lavender on the windowsill and watched Gabriel, grown now, with a law book in his hands, walk toward the gate, his posture a mixture of his father's deliberation and his mother's steady hands. She smiled, folded her cloth, and threaded her needle one last time for the evening. She threaded the needle slowly, as if each pass through the silk were a small benediction. The lamp cast a circle of amber across the table. Beyond it, the valley sunk into the soft, unhurried dark that always followed a winter day. Gabriel's figure receded toward the gate, and then the road. He paused once and turned, a small, deliberate silhouette against the frost-gray sky. Clara lifted her hand in the old, unshowy way she had of sending someone off, palm to heart, a straight little nod, and then she bent again to her cloth. Days folded into one another after that evening, the house settling around its new rhythm. There were morning papers for Gabriel to read, occasional visitors whose business was plain and necessary, the rhythmic work of mending and cataloging and planning. Clara's hands, which had once been quick as birds, moved with a careful economy now. She kept the needle in a small dish by the lamp where she could reach it without hunting. When the sun came early and thin through the net curtains, she would rise, put the kettle on, set a cup for Gabriel, as if he might still come in for the mid-morning rest he had once allowed himself, and then go about the small ministrations that tied the household together. Neighbors kept to their own days, but made certain to pass by for bread or to borrow a tool, and when they did, Clara received them with the quiet exactness of someone who had given the better part of a life to listening. She asked after a son or a wife or a harvest, and when they answered, she kept a face that did not hurry to judgment. Children, emboldened by the calm of the house, sat on the floor with bits of thread and learned to knot the loose ends. The school's bell still rang on the hour, and the dispensary window shed a clean light over the small waiting line of those who could not pay more than a favor. Gabriel's work deepened. He found in the cadence of cases and the steadiness of statutes a way to make the bargain that had launched their household into something else. He argued with a courtliness that had been taught by no rhetoric alone, but by the memory of hands that had tended both ledger and life. He took on those who would make the valley a ledger of profit, not a ledger of people. And he did it in ways that wore the markers of his mother's influence. Appeals that began with small facts, hearings that asked for testimony rather than indictment, settlements that built schools and dispensaries rather than vast, indifferent walls. There came, in the 3rd year after the bargain, a case that would test both the valley and the Casa Grande. A new estate owner from the city purchased, by fast money and quiet persuasion, tracts of land on the edge of the valley. He walked the fields with men who measured margins in a language that made the farmers restless. The owner's plan was not implicitly wicked. He spoke of improved yields and modern equipment and the promise of work. But his promises came with leases of a kind that would hollow local labor of its former protections. Men who had tilled adjacent soil for generations found themselves offered work with pay that lived only while profits allowed, and the school and dispensary worried about loss of steady patronage. The village council met in the schoolroom. Gabriel attended as their counsel, but also as a son who had been raised here. Clara, though she kept mostly to the Casa Grande now, came down from time to time and stood at the doorway with a shawl about her shoulders and a look of an old seamstress who knows easily how to spot a bad stitch. "You cannot fight windmills," one man said in the meeting, a youngish farmer who had 70 acres and little tolerance for philosophical arguments. "He will buy out what he needs. He will underprice us until we have no choice." Gabriel listened. He wore the coat that had once been too large for him, a coat that hung with the patient dignity of someone who had learned to let law give shape to anger. "Then we must change the rules by which the price is measured," he said. "If the lease erodes the laborer's rights, then it will be declared void. If the promises that secure investment take from the school and the dispensary, they will be conditioned upon their continuation." A heated argument followed. There were men who feared the unknown in both directions, profit and loss, and women who said that what they wanted from any plan were stable days for their children. Clara did not speak much that evening, though those who looked to her saw, as they always did, the careful mettle of someone who preferred repair to triumph. In the end, the council voted to resist the lease's most pernicious clauses and to demand safeguards for the laborers, and Gabriel set to work drafting agreements and speaking to lawyers who dealt in different currency and different mouths. The negotiations took time. There were letters sent from offices in the city, and there were men in suits who came and went, smiling and pegging their promises on the ledger of the future. The neighbors watched and waited. Gabriel's manner did not swell with anger. There were days he strode with a tired set to his jaw, and nights when he would not come to supper because he had been called to the court at the city. Clara learned slowly how to set another cup at table and to thread another hem. Then, in the late spring, when the lavender stirred and the valley's green curved like a slow bird wing, Clara began to cough in the mornings. It was an old, brittle thing that she tried to hide, the cough that caused her to pause at the wash-basin as if to collect herself. She would, for a day or two, excuse herself from the council, and Gabriel would, speaking less than he might, say she was tired or that the wind had been harsh. The dispensary tended to her with the gentle economy of a place that knew how to measure comfort against the weight of prognosis. They offered tinctures and rest and the advice that one must keep warm. Winter had not yet left the valley when she was too tired to stitch for more than a half-hour at a time. The needle lay in its dish like an idle oar. Clara took to sitting at the window and looking at the lavender hill in small, patient increments of attention. She listened with a kind of concentration that made Gabriel uneasy, the way a farmer might listen for the first frost. "Do you remember the law of the land?" she asked him one dusk, her voice thin but steady. "Not the law you read to the judges, the law we learned from hands." He came to her side and took the small papered hand she offered. "I remember," he said. He married months later, quietly, according to the wishes of those who felt marriage owed no spectacle. His wife, Anna, had been a school teacher in the village, someone whose voice brought small children to order, and whose laugh smelled of lemon peel and ink. She and Gabriel had come to know one another in the work of protecting the valley's rights. Where Gabriel took the courtroom, Anna took the classroom, and they aligned as people who believed that steadiness must be practiced. Clara approved of Anna with the slow, hard-earned clarity of someone who had seen both the ruin of good intentions and the small miracles that are possible when people show up. Anna visited Clara when Gabriel could not. She sat, sometimes with a needle in her hand, and learned the small, precise motions of mending from a woman who had taught a generation to make seams hold. There were evenings when the three of them sat at the long kitchen table and spoke of accounts and of children and of small victories. There was, beneath the domestic speech, a subdued acknowledgment of the finite hour upon which Clara rode with admirable dignity. When the cough became a shadow that lingered through the night, Gabriel read everything he could about comforts: how to make soups that warmed without tiring, which tincture steadied an anxious pulse. He would return from court with papers tucked under his arm and pause at the doorway to see Clara sleeping in a chair by the lamp. He would bend and kiss her forehead in a gesture that had no ceremony but carried everything. He learned the language of a child's care for an elder woman, the bringing of water, the softening of a voice that had known too much sternness. On a clear morning in late summer, when the lavender had gone to seed and the valley smelled like newly turned earth, Clara called for Gabriel. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: She sat up in the bed she had kept upstairs, one of her hands beneath the quilts and one resting on the window frame. A frase anterior está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. She sat up in the bed she had kept upstairs, one of her hands beneath the quilts and one resting on the window frame. The light there was soft, as if someone had favored that room with mercy. Gabriel came quickly, breathless, and Anna followed with a tray that trembled as she held it. My boy, Clara said, and the word landed with both the weight of the past and the lightness of what remained. Do not let them forget the little things. Gabriel looked at her with something between a laugh and a sob. I will not, he said. We will keep the school. We will keep the dispensary. We will keep the land's openness. I have work to do yet. He paused, then asked in a voice that tried to be simple, Is there anything I can do for you? Clara smiled with a small, weary amusement. Take the needle, she said, and he did not understand at first, the way a man might not see an offered coin for its deeper currency. She reached slowly and took his larger hand in her small one. He felt, under the skin, a warmth like the memory of a stove. You will stitch what needs mending, even when mending is hard to begin, she said. Set the table for the people who come. If they come hungry, do not feed them only bread. Teach them to hold a loaf in both hands. She laughed, a short, surprised sound that told him she heard the joke in her own words. And Gabriel, she said, and the name was a bell. Remember that bargains are sometimes blessings when you make them with an aim toward others. He stayed with her then, in the white, halting way of vigil that does not demand speech. He read to her from letters that came from the farms they had helped, from parents thanking the dispensary for a nurse who saved a babe, from a school teacher who wrote of a child who had learned to read. Clara's eyes, clouded with the fatigue of years, tracked the lines with the slow brilliance of someone who had once read the world in a meter of seams and book spines. When she slept, it was with a face that had known laughter and labor both. The day she died was calm. The valley had pulled its breath in and seemed to hold it. Gabriel sat beside her, one hand on the quilt, his other holding hers. Anna stood at the foot of the bed. Outside, someone rang the school bell, as if to say that life's small rituals would not be shattered by sorrow. It was a clean, quiet passing, the kind that brings a kind of relief and a breaking at once. The funeral was simple and true to the life she had led. People came walking, some with spades stained from their morning work, others with children who fidgeted and held at their skirts the way small things hold to the edges of a ceremony. The church was modest. The minister read words that Gabriel listened to with a narrow, steady attention. The coffin was plain, the wood polished by hands who had been trained to do such work with dignity. Clara's shawl lay across it, folded as she might have folded a hem. At the graveside, Gabriel spoke. He did not make grand promises. His words were the steadiness of a ledger entry, a statement of fact and of intention woven together. He thanked those who had come to the house with soup and kind words. He promised that the school bell would ring, that the dispensary would remain open for those who needed it most, that no bargain would be struck that traded away the lives of the valley's people. He placed his hand upon the earth of the grave, as if feeling, for a moment, the grain of the world beneath his fingers. Then the lavender was set upon the coffin in a small, precise heap, and the shovel bit into the dirt. People took turns making the small, necessary motion of marking the end and the continuation. Clara's daughter-in-law, no, not daughter-in-law, Anna, gathered the children and walked them back to the school, where they were given hot milk and bread and the order of the day. Life reassembled itself around a gap, the loom missing a thread, the table missing a hand that had always fixed the cloth. Weeks passed. The county's hearings about the lease concluded with adjustments. Gabriel negotiated so that the new owner, recognizing that steady labor could not be replaced by fleeting profit, agreed to terms that kept the school and the dispensary funded and which established a workers' council to mediate wages and conditions. The valley did not go untouched by modern pressures, but it kept its shape, the way a well-made shirt keeps its collar when washed properly. There were moments when Gabriel found himself in the small study at the back of the Casa Grande, a ledger before him and his mother's handwriting remembered like a map. He would open a drawer where she had kept her needles and find the dish with one last needle, simple and serviceable. Sometimes Anna would take it and show a child how to thread it, and the child's small mouth would make a serious face as he learned to tie the knot. Years later, when the lavender returned in its faithful, riotous purple, Gabriel would take a sprig and place it by the stone on the hill where Clara lay. He would stand and watch the valley breathing under the wind, and feel, in the measure of the light, the continuity she had always prized. There were new faces in the school, new hands at the dispensary, and there were children whose parents would tell, in passing, the story of the woman who had once threaded needles by the lamplight and turned bargains into lives. Clara's house became less solitary. The Casa Grande kept its steadiness, with Gabriel and Anna at its center, and the small ritual of visitors that had always been part of its life, a seam unstitchable but repaired with tenderness. There were times when Gabriel would find a slip of paper in his mother's handwriting among the ledgers, little notes about who owed what, a name circled, and a short instruction, and he would laugh quietly, as if hearing her voice in a margin. When he grew older, and his own hair took the silver that had once marked his father, he would take to walking the hill on clear mornings, pausing at the stones to read the names engraved there. He taught his children, a son who loved numbers and a daughter who loved prance, the care of the house and the importance of keeping the small things right. He taught them how to listen to a neighbor's complaint as if it were a fabric fraying at the seam. "Make no bargains in haste," he would say, borrowing his mother's plain counsel. "Make bargains that let the next stitch be possible." The valley held, as valleys do, the marks of seasons. There were droughts and small tragedies, quiet reconciliations, and the stubborn goodness of people who memorized kindness the way others memorize prayers. Clara's needle remained in its dish on the shelf, where Anna kept the lamp lit at night. It was not a relic so much as a habit, a reminder that diligence, quiet and sustained, was often the force that steadied life's small boat. On an autumn day, many years from the lamp-lit evenings of Clara's later life, Gabriel sat by a window and watched a small child learn to thread a needle. The child's hands were clumsy and earnest, and the light caught in the dust motes like a congregation rising to its feet. Gabriel smiled and then bent to write, in a careful hand not unlike his mother's, a small note to pin in the schoolroom, a schedule for the dispensary, the names of those who would teach the next round of apprentices, the place where the ledger would be kept so that everyone could see. The needle, idle no longer, sat ready beside his pen. He lifted it, and, with the practiced gentleness his mother had taught, passed it through the cloth, and, with a single, sure stitch, began again the work that makes communities last. The endless, unsexy mending of the things that keep people whole. He thought of bargains not as transactions, but as chances to make small things right. And in that thought there was at once grief and a strange, bright hope. The valley went on, as it must. The church bell tolled on Sundays. The dispensary opened at appointed hours. The school bell knelled children into learning. In the Casa Grande, the lamp was lit at dusk. The needle kept warm in its small dish, and the lavender bent in the wind like a congregation bowed in steady prayer. Clara's name was on a stone on the hill, but more importantly, it lived in the way meals were made for the sick, and in the ledger entries that always, first and foremost, counted people. When Gabriel closed the ledger at night, he could still hear, as if in the memory of the house's wood and stone, the faint shush of a needle passing through a seam, a small, constant music. He was no longer a young man, but was of an age to understand how finite and precarious the years had been. He found in the cadence of his days a quiet contentment that was not triumph, but service.